Every year, 1 in 100 children are diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders nationwide. A look into the dangers of consuming alcohol while pregnant, how it has affected children, and what our community is doing to address this ongoing problem. I'm Rana Kamal. This is Our Issues, Twin Cities.
Having all of these deficits also allows me to see that it's more important to focus on your strengths rather than, trying to fix things that can't be fixed.
Gary was diagnosed with FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, at just 18 months.
FASD for me has been kind of a hindrance, but at the same time kind of a good thing. It's made it really hard for me to read, write, do math in my head. So those things are really hard to do, as well as organization and planning ahead. But other than that, I think it also has given me the opportunity to see the world in a different way.
I think it's the #1 public health epidemic. 1 out of 20 kids have an FASD.
Barb's 16-year-old daughter lives with FASD. As an adopted child, much was unknown to her parents, leading to her late diagnosis. When did you start to notice that something was wrong?
When she started to walk and talk. So we adopted her when she was 5.5 weeks old, and she was very typical in her development as far as rolling over, walking, talking, all of that kind of stuff. But I always thought something was a little bit different. She was very high-spirited, very high-strung, very much an attention seeker, and just had a really hard time behaviorally from the get-go. One of the big things that led us to figuring it out, it was her issues with stealing, which she had started to do when she was 2 years old in the church nursery, which is a typical developmental thing for a toddler to do. And then a parent or a caregiver gives consequences and they learn not to. But she never learned not to. And finally, I started Googling kids stealing, childhood theft issues, all these phrases around that. And I came to a list of the behaviors and challenges that people with the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder have. And she met every one of them.
Every year, about 7,000 children are born in Minnesota with alcohol exposure before birth, putting them at risk of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
It's a spectrum. You've seen one child or one person with FASD, you've seen one person. You can't really generalize.
Kim is the Director of Communications and Development for MOFAS, Minnesota Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome.
FASD is what we consider this spectrum, right? So fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And that's a full spectrum of disability that is caused by a woman drinking alcohol while pregnant. Fetal alcohol syndrome is the farthest end of that, and that is characterized by physical anomalies, intellectual anomalies, behavioral, emotional, a full panoply. FASD, though, can encompass some things and maybe not others. And Gary's a perfect example. Gary is intellectually brilliant, I would say, absolutely brilliant, and very, very high functioning, able to do quite a lot of things. Other kids, maybe not so much.
How does FASD affect a child?
On the far end, severe intellectual, everything from a smaller brain to inability to function in some cases, to, on the lighter end of the scale, which might be fewer problems, but still persistent. These are things that are, again, permanent brain disability will be with the child throughout his or her life.
There are 3 main facial features of fetal alcohol syndrome: smooth philtrum, thin upper lip, and short palpebral features. Only 10 to 20% of children born with FASD have these facial features.
The rest have no physical features, and most of our kids and adults with this seem very typical in conversation because their verbal expressive skills are one of their strengths. And so, yet in so many other areas, they struggle significantly.
Most people with FASD do not show visible signs of prenatal alcohol exposure, which can lead to misdiagnosis, frequently treated for emotional and behavioral problems.
There's a stigma that comes with the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. There's a huge stigma. But also just the education hasn't been out there. It really wasn't until the 70s that this was kind of figured out in the United States and became like a medical diagnosis.
So that families have access to FASD diagnostic services, MOFAS's clinic has the capability to accurately diagnose the disorder.
At our clinic, we spend roughly 8 hours with a patient going over all kinds of neuropsychological tests, physical examinations, etc., to really fully diagnose this. But because of that, it's very involved, right? So here in Minnesota, even though we know that there are some 7,000 children born exposed to alcohol every single year, just here in Minnesota. Just here. But we only have the capacity in this state to diagnose 800 of those kids.
Why is that?
Because we just don't have the diagnostic clinics available. We have quite a few. The University of Minnesota is the biggest. MOFAS, we have one. But the tests are so involved and it's so expensive to do that 800 is what our capacity is. Given that, we really do need more awareness of FASD and we absolutely need more diagnosis, and that comes with more awareness of this issue.
In 2013, Minnesota had the second highest rate of alcohol consumption among women in their childbearing years ranging from 18 to 44, trailing behind North Dakota. What are the major reasons you think a woman might drink during her pregnancy?
They don't know, or they're not informed that it can cause these adverse effects. Second thing I would say is, especially for like some doctors will say, oh, it's fine to have a small drink here and there.
Perhaps the ever so changing research throughout the years on consuming alcohol while pregnant has been confusing and misleading.
Just about once or twice a year, there's some expert that will go on the Today Show or some big morning TV show and sit and say it's okay to have a glass a day.
Today, no amount of alcohol consumed during pregnancy is considered safe, according to a new report from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Why do you think the studies continue to fluctuate?
You can't do a study where you say to a woman, you drink 1 glass of alcohol a week, to another woman, you drink 5, and then when your babies are born, we'll take a look and see how they are. That's completely unethical. So we can't do that research. We can only look at children who are born after the fact and see what the effect of their mother's drinking alcohol is, right? So now scientists are taking a harder look at that, and they're seeing that we just don't know what the safe level of alcohol is. We don't know. We know that on the far end of the spectrum, a lot of alcohol can cause fetal alcohol syndrome, which is the worst form of FASD. But we don't know. We don't know that 1 drink a week is safe. We don't.
Honestly, kind of sad that we still have, professionals saying that sort of thing, because it's proven false, and I'm proof.
When we return, the staggering number of foster children affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
Kind of started a whole new journey for us, and trying to learn as much as we could about FASD.
After Barb's daughter was diagnosed with FASD at the age of 6, she began to dedicate her life to help other parents whose children live with the disorder. How do you work with families and individuals who do have FASD?
It is incredibly challenging parenting teenagers who have brain damage from prenatal alcohol exposure. So that is the majority of families that I end up really supporting at a high level. It's when their kids are hitting those teen and young adult years. And so I lead several support groups. I work part-time with the North American Council on Adoptable Children.
Because foster children often come from families with histories of alcohol abuse, researchers have found that rates of fetal alcohol syndrome are as much as 10 times higher than the general population. In fact, over 70% of children with full-blown FAS are in foster or adoptive placement.
A lot of the alcohol exposure happens in drug use and other things where a child might be taken away from the home.
Michael, who is a foster parent of a son diagnosed with FASD, is a psychologist at the Indian Health Board of Minneapolis. As a foster parent and a psychologist, how do you work with other foster parents who have children with FASD?
I think one of the greatest ways to work with them is to tell stories that they recognize, so that they understand I'm not just a professional who has learned this in a book or just through experience with working with people. I'm actually living it, and for them to hear the challenges that often don't sound very successful, even when someone like myself who's supposed to know what's going on, it doesn't work for me all the time either, but we just kind of keep moving.
Today, Michael holds workshops on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. What advice are they generally seeking from you concerning their child who suffers from FASD?
The advice is often, how do I get the child to do what I want them to? How do we gain more compliance? And that's really a hard challenge. And I often coach people that maybe that's not exactly your first level goal, and that what you may want to start focusing on is how do you start building the child up and be more strengths-based? Because kids, any kid will respond really well to strengths-based approaches, giving compliments and noticing the positive things that are going on, and then working on the challenging behaviors next.
Recently, a new law was put into place after Governor Mark Dayton signed legislation making Minnesota the first state in the nation requiring foster parents to receive training on how to recognize and treat the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure. Today, the law requires all newly licensed foster parents to receive an hour of training on parenting strategies for children with FASD. Through specialized training, Michael helps foster parents identify strategies for coping and interacting with their children. What specialized training do you offer to the foster parents with children with FASD?
For FASD, I think it's important for people to have the whole picture. If I, as a psychologist, look at the behaviors of a kid with FASD, I might just see behavior problems, and I might recommend a behavior chart and earn stickers and rewards, and and that would help. A teacher would probably see more learning disabilities, and so would use those kinds of interventions. A pediatrician might see attention problems and prescribe medication, and none of those are exactly wrong, but you can't just throw intervention after intervention at a kid and expect it to work. For a kid with FASD, you have to have the whole picture and coordinate everything so that you're making progress in one area and maybe waiting and being patient in the other area.
Along with running support groups for parents, Barb provides training for parents and professionals. She also contracts with schools to assist them to better understand the needs of kids living with FASD.
At 18 years old, a young person with an FASD has the verbal expressive skills of a 20-year-old, but they have the emotional maturity of a 6-year-old. And they have the time and money concepts, I think it's around 8 years old. And this is when they're 18 and graduating high school. So we tell parents, we tell educators, we tell people who are working with these kids, take their age, cut it in half, and that's about where they're functioning at. And so once we're able to kind of sit and explain that and help the school to understand the developmental picture of the child that they're dealing with, whether it's a 10-year-old, but if you've got a 10-year-old sitting there, they have the verbal expressive skills of a 10-year-old or maybe even 11 or a 12-year-old. And that's why the teacher and the principals are sitting there saying, no, this kid gets it, I know they do. And if we're able to sit and explain their brain development and the fact that yes, verbally they're able to sit here and have a conversation like they're age appropriate, but really if we break it down, they're not. So if we're able to do that with schools, we start to see huge improvement in how the child is doing.
Working with these schools, are you seeing a more positive outcome?
We'll start to see that once the staff actually understand the child's disability and start to educate them a little bit differently, and some of the accommodations and modifications that they need to make are not huge. It's not even, some of the changes are really little, like breaking down multi-step directions. That's one of the things that our kids struggle with. If you give them 3 directions at once, they will sit and not do the first one because they can't remember that, because working memory is one of their biggest deficits. And so in working with the schools to help them understand that kind of stuff, we are starting to see students doing much better.
Up next on Our Issues Twin Cities, raising awareness towards the epidemic of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is the leading cause of developmental disabilities in the U.S. Most children living with FASD function at a level half their age and face a spectrum of obstacles. 61% of adolescents experience significant school disruptions. They're 2 to 3 times likely to be bullied, and 60% are likely to have a run-in with the law.
The number of folks like in juvenile detention or probably even in prisons is thought to be really highly represented by those with FASD, because some of the decision-making process that they have can be impacted or impaired, right? So it's very important to understand that someone may be acting in a way that makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to the rest of us as society, and so we might not give them the correct intervention, right? And so then they end up going down the pathway and ending into the incarceration, the school dropout, some of the risk factors and secondary problems that kids can get into in adults.
I was somewhat depressed. I didn't necessarily like being in this separate room. I wanted to learn, but I couldn't convey that very easily.
Teachers rejected his advancement and held him at least 1 grade below. He was also bullied by fellow classmates and bullied others. How have you overcome those challenges?
A lot of times it just takes patience and basically just asking for it over and over again. Never really backing down, because it can be hard, especially within, middle school and high school. All these teachers and administration, they all look down on you, but you just have to keep going.
1 in 10 women drink while pregnant, potentially harming the way a child learns and behaves. While there isn't a cure for this epidemic, FASD is 100% preventable.
FASD will not happen if a woman chooses not to drink alcohol while she's pregnant. Can't happen.
Can it be treated?
Yes, it can be treated, but as Gary has indicated, the treatments vary and they're not always effective, right? So as Gary has said, he's been treated for ADHD, which is a part of what he has being diagnosed with FASD. But because this is a permanent brain disability, some of it is just not treatable. What you have to do is simply learn to live with it and have, as Gary says, appropriate accommodation so that he's able to do what he is able to achieve, but he needs some help to do it.
Today, Barb's daughter is entering her senior year of high school at a special education school. How is she doing today?
Considering how badly her brain is impacted by the alcohol, she does really, really well. But what happened is my husband and I many years ago had to it wasn't a lowering of our expectations, but we definitely had to adjust our expectations and what we can expect from her. And we realized, our dream with all of our children when we started this parenting journey was that they would go to college. We have learned that is not the journey for every kid, nor should it be. And so we've adjusted our expectations and, based on that and kind of us starting to deal in a different way with her instead of always coming at a really consequence-based reaction to her behaviors and her issues, things kind of started to calm down.
Since 1998, MOFAS has been the home for families affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Today, they lead the charge in guiding and supporting families through their FASD journey.
We have several support groups. So we have support groups for birth moms. We have support groups for parents who have adopted children with an FASD. And we have a youth group, for instance, that Gary's a big part of, for kids who have FASD.
How important was their support to you?
Very important. Without their support, I probably wouldn't have been successful at all. The people around me saying that they believe in me, that they know I can do these things, and supporting me in pursuing my strengths rather than my weaknesses really does help.
With their simple motto, zero alcohol for 9 months, MOFAS envisions a world in which women do not consume alcohol during pregnancy and people living with FASD are identified, supported, and valued. How important is it to raise awareness towards FASD?
It's an incredibly huge number, and yet how many of us have actually heard of FASD? I mean, you might have heard of fetal alcohol syndrome, but when you hear that number, that it affects 1 in 100 kids, you realize the scope and the scale of this. It's huge. And then you realize that it's completely 100% preventable if you just don't drink when you're pregnant. And so that's what we want to get out there.
The awareness is very important because we have to keep ourselves steady. We have to make sure that we put interventions and accommodations in place to support them, just like we would for someone who has a walking disability or any other kind of disability.
And as Gary works to defy the challenges posed by his disabilities, he dreams to be a theoretical astrophysicist.
I don't like to see that other people go through what I've had to go through. Yes, I am slightly higher functioning, as you said, but it's not, I'm not perfect by any means. I work hours and hours on homework, whereas most people would want to work maybe 1 hour. So I just don't want others to have to go through the struggles that I've had.
Thank you for joining me this week on Our Issues Twin Cities. I'm Brenda Kaman. See you next time.